Okay, I'll let you get this.
All right.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Happy birthday, National Park Service.
Woo-hoo!
Today is our 100-year anniversary, our centennial of the National Park Service. Who was at the quarter release this morning?
We're there.
Late.
Late.
I just handed out some quarters and Jack helped me. And those are shiny, new Theodore Roosevelt National Park quarters. And we just released those today. We had a great morning. The sun came out for about an hour and a half, and we had a glorious service. So I am Wendy Ross. I am the superintendent at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And I am so thrilled to be here tonight to celebrate this very special day of the National Park Service. And we have a very special speaker for you tonight. Clay Jenkinson is one of those speakers that I try to see every time I know he's going to be in the area. He's somebody who always inspires me. He gives me epiphanies. He changes my paradigm. He changes my thinking. He makes me think about what I do as a manager of this park. And that's all. Clay is an amazing person, and I've gotten to know him pretty well, I think, over a couple of glasses of wine and a lot of meetings. And Clay and I most recently have been working on the Theodore Roosevelt National Presidential Library, which we would like to partner with. And I think it's a wonderful example of how we're leveraging our resources in the National Park Service, how we're reaching out to our communities and taking care of that web, that ecosystem of recreation, tourism, preservation, and community. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Clay Jenkinson, esteemed historian, humanities scholar, and friend.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Let me start by asking if you can all hear me. Louder? Okay, so I rejected the microphone, and I rejected the PowerPoint, and for good reason. I think I feel very strongly, and I hope you will agree, that we over-mediate our experience. We spend too much time in front of screens. We let too many things get between us and the world. And that's particularly true when you're in a place as beautiful as this. I can't imagine a more beautiful day in a more beautiful place. And if you were at the coin ceremony this morning, the person from the mint said, "I doubt that we have ever released a coin with a more beautiful backdrop than Painted Canyon Scenic Overlook in the Badlands of North Dakota." This is really one of the great gems of the National Park Service. There are 59 full-blown national parks. This is one of them. It's the only one named for a person and the only one named for a president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. That makes it very special. It wasn't a park when he was here, and he didn't make it a park. It became a national park in 1947. It was a national memorial park from 1947 until the late 1970s, and then it became a full-on national park. Roosevelt spent the better part of 4 years here, between 1883 and 1887, and it transformed his life in a fundamental way, and he went on to become the greatest conservationist of any president in American history, and I want to talk a little bit about that tonight. But before I do, I want to just say a couple quick things. First of all, Wendy mentioned the Theodore Roosevelt National Presidential Library. Herbert Hoover was the first president to have a presidential library. The idea hadn't been thought of, and now every president by law is required to deposit his papers in a library at a location of his choice. So Bill Clinton's is in Little Rock, George W. Bush's is in Dallas, and Barack Obama's will be in Chicago. But every president now must deposit his or her papers in a library. That wasn't true until the middle of the 20th century, and so many great presidents are without presidential libraries, and one of them is Theodore Roosevelt. So about 10 years ago, we at Jenkinson State University, which is just up the road, got it into our heads to digitize the Roosevelt papers. His presidential papers are in the Library of Congress. His personal papers are largely at Harvard. etc. And so none of those institutions is going to give us those physical documents. But we decided to digitize as many of Roosevelt's papers as we possibly could and create the most comprehensive electronic presidential library in the country. We have done enormously interesting work in that regard. That's the Theodore Roosevelt Center. And we are now routinely consulted by everyone working on Roosevelt. We're going to become the repository of choice for all Roosevelt scholarship, and we already to a very large extent are. We need more money to accelerate the process of digitizing these documents. It's one thing to scan a letter written by Theodore Roosevelt to his son Kermit, but that letter, once scanned, means nothing until you add descriptive data called metadata, and that processing of metadata is a very time-consuming and complex and scholarly endeavor. We have a wonderful staff at Jenkinson State University, but it's a small staff and we're underfunded. But meanwhile, we're doing this. And it's changing Roosevelt studies and it's changing presidential papers projects. In 2013, the legislature of North Dakota gave us a very large sum of money as the seed of a national Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library to be located in western North Dakota. We are now raising money for that. We're in a very elaborate planning phase. All I can tell you is it's going to be a library and museum and convening center in Jenkinson, North Dakota that's worthy of the 26th President of the United States. In other words, when we're finished with it, around 2019 or 2020, when you come to see it, we want you to think, that's exactly what Roosevelt would have wanted. That's exactly the sort of place he would have wanted for his presidential library. Some people think it should be made in Oyster Bay on Long Island, but they had a chance to do it, and their project fell apart, and so we felt, why not western North Dakota? Because as you know, in 1910, former President Roosevelt came back to Fargo, North Dakota, to dedicate a library, and he said, and I quote, "I would never have been the President of the United States had it not been for the time I spent in North Dakota." We North Dakotans are required to memorize that at birth because it gives us this link to this extraordinary man. And so one of the things that I began to look at when I came back to North Dakota 10 years ago, I grew up in Jenkinson. I had lived away for some of my adulthood. I moved back because I loved this place so much. I wanted to determine what he meant by that. Was he just saying the kind of thing you say when you go to Gillette, Wyoming, or Wadena, Minnesota? Do you say some flattering thing about what that community has meant to you? Or did he really mean what he said? And it's been a really interesting intellectual process. You would think that by now Roosevelt studies would have exhausted the character and the achievement of Theodore Roosevelt, but it's not true at all. We need many, many, many more studies of Roosevelt from different angles, and we believe very firmly at the Roosevelt Center that it's true what he said, that he would never have been the Roosevelt of Mount Rushmore, the Roosevelt who sent the Great White Fleet around the globe, the Roosevelt who secured the Panama Canal, Roosevelt the trust buster, Roosevelt the man who intervened in the Russo-Japanese War in 1906 and won the Nobel Peace Prize because of it. We think he would never have been that person had it not been for his experience here. And you are sitting right in his stomping grounds. He had two ranches, one south of Medora, 7 miles, called the Maltese Cross or Chimney Butte Ranch. And he had a second ranch about 25 miles north of here, called the Elkhorn Ranch. And he spent the better part of those years between 1883 and 1887 ranching and hunting and acting as a deputy sheriff, writing books, refreshing his spirit, and learning something about the nature of the American West here that influenced his life and really changed the course of American history. And you would not be here tonight were it not for Theodore Roosevelt. He did not create the national parks. The first national park was Yellowstone in 1872. There were 5 national parks when he became president of the United States in September of 1901, but he doubled that number to 10, and he would have gone much further if he could have. But Congress was not in a mood to fund national parks. In fact, the Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time, a man named Joseph Cannon, said of Roosevelt's conservation agenda, and I'm quoting, "Not 1 cent for scenery." Not 1 cent for scenery. And so Roosevelt had to work around congressional paralysis in order to accomplish what he did. So I'm going to start with what he accomplished. And then I want to ask a very difficult question that I don't have the answer to. He created 5 national parks. He added 150 million acres to the national forest system, tripling it. He invented, by executive order, the National Wildlife Refuge System. He called them federal bird sanctuaries. He invented this one day, and he named the first 51, 2 of which, by the way, here in North Dakota. He signed the Monuments and Antiquities Act in 1906, and then he designated the first 18 national monuments, including Devil's Tower, his first, and later the Grand Canyon. He wanted the Grand Canyon to be a national park, but Congress wouldn't do it, and so he decided to find a different mechanism. And the National Monuments and Antiquities Act was really designed for the president to set aside tiny little parcels like Devil's Tower or a cliff dwelling somewhere to protect them. But Roosevelt read the law expansively, as usual, and so he designated the Grand Canyon as a national monument at 828,000 acres. It was one of the boldest acts of conservation leadership in history. And of course, later, it graduated up to become a national park. He also signed the Reclamation Act in 1902 and designated the first 24 federal irrigation and reclamation projects. In short, during the course of his 7 years and 171 days as the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt designated 230 million acres of the public domain as national park, national forest, national wildlife refuge, national monument, national game preserve, etc. Think of that. No person in American history has done that. Now, Jimmy Carter added a few more acres than did Roosevelt, but they were essentially in Alaska. Roosevelt did this in the lower 48 states. Some of his work was in Alaska, which was then a territory. So here's my question. How did it happen that Theodore Roosevelt came to do this? His predecessor, William McKinley, did almost nothing for conservation. His successor, William Howard Taft, was not particularly interested in conservation. In fact, he fired the nation's first forester, Gifford Pinchot. Woodrow Wilson was not particularly interested. Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding. You see my point, that one president of this era, and one only, was so deeply committed to this idea that he used an enormous amount of his political capital and his national and international popularity to set aside 230 million acres of the public domain. And don't think that this was easy, that the public was hungry for this and he was just fulfilling a public need. In many respects, the public at the time was indifferent to these things, unsure why we would need to set aside western acreages. And so Roosevelt's leadership is very particular and personal and special in this regard. So think of what he did. He's a New Yorker, born in New York City. He's an urban man. He's a Harvard-educated man, a highly educated man. He speaks with a funny falsetto voice, and when he gets excited, his voice went straight up. There's a certain pretentiousness to the way he talks. He wears pince-nez glasses. He belongs to all the best social clubs in the world. He comes from a wealthy family, not a rich family, but a pretty wealthy family. And on top of all of that, he was a physically fragile human being. He was not a robust man. He became a robust man But he was actually born a fragile person. He had very severe childhood asthma. There was no cure for asthma at the time, hardly any coping mechanisms. His family physician warned the family that he probably would not live to be an adult. He had asthma fits so severe that his family thought he would suffocate in his own bed. He went to Maine when he was 12 or 13 years old to sort of toughen up a little bit. He got off the train and there were 3 bullies there, and they decided to pick on him because of his spectacles, because of his glasses. And he said that they didn't beat him up, but they kept beating on him just enough so that he couldn't fight back, just enough to humiliate him. They could have done much more severe damage, but they toyed with him because he said he was pathetic. He was the kind of victim that people look for. And on that occasion, when that bullying incident occurred in Maine, he said to himself, I will never again be bullied. I am going to toughen myself up, and I will never again be successfully bullied. He later said of his father, he was the greatest man I ever knew and the only man I ever feared. When Theodore was 12, his father took him aside after a very difficult year when Roosevelt's health was really a big impediment to the family's routines. And his father said, my son, your body is weak, but your mind is strong. You will never achieve your potential if your body lags behind your mind. He said, I'm going to challenge you. You must make your body. And Roosevelt decided to do it. And through sheer force of his will and a desire to please his father and not be bullied, he transformed himself from essentially a 98-pound weakling into a man that was so adventurous that he was at times reckless. That alone marks him as an extremely unusual human being. But why did this Eastern, highly educated, social aristocrat become so enamored of the American West that he decided to use his life to find mechanisms of protection for it? There's no answer to this question. If I had one, I'd give it to you. I'll give you my best thoughts about it. He came here in 1883 to kill a buffalo. He reckoned that buffalo were going to go extinct. They were right on the brink of extinction. And in typical Roosevelt fashion, he wanted to get one first. And so he came out, and he came to North Dakota because he could get here. He couldn't get to South Dakota because there was no train. There were 2 places he could get. He could get to the Union Pacific line that runs through Nebraska, or he could get to the Northern Pacific line that runs through Medora here. And he chose this one. But if there had been a chance for him to get to the Black Hills, he might well have gone there, and we wouldn't be having this talk. So the transportation system of the Industrial Revolution enabled him to get to the place where he romanticized the American West. You see the paradox. So he came to kill a buffalo, and he got his buffalo, and you can still see it in the North Room at Sycamore Hill on Long Island. But while he was here, he fell in love with this place. And if you're just passing through from somewhere else, I hope you give yourself enough time tomorrow to go see the Petrified Forest, or to drive the Loop Road, or go to the North Unit, or drive out to the Elkhorn Ranch. They're all quite easily accessible. In my own opinion, the Petrified Forest hike is the best hike in the park, but they're all great. The coin that was issued today shows Roosevelt on horseback on a bluff of the Badlands overlooking his beloved Little Missouri River. I can't tell you how much that has moved me to think that the coin doesn't show him as the president with a globe at his side. It shows him here as a young man being formed by this place, and he loved horses. He loved the idea of being a cowboy. He loved the idea of being a ranch owner and a big game hunter. And he wanted to be part of law and order. And so while he was here, he arrested boat thieves and marched them to justice. He punched out a drunken gunslinger in a bar in Webo, Montana. He went on roundups where there were actual stampedes, and he writes vividly of the stampedes that he was in. He had encounters with Native Americans that were a little bit tense. He got his first grizzly bear in the Bighorn Mountains in 1884. While he was here, he got his first buffalo, and then he got his first bighorn sheep, and then he got his first cougar, mountain lion. He got his first elk, and then he went to Montana and got his first mountain goat. When you read these things about this phase of Roosevelt's life when he was 24 and 25 years old, it's a little unsettling at times because he really likes to kill animals. He loves to kill animals, and one of the ironies that Sharon Kilzer, who's here from the Roosevelt Center, and I have found is that he's always writing and saying, I was wandering through the Badlands today and I killed the last elk. And you think, really? You want to write that up? And then like 2 months later he says, no, today I got the last elk. It comes several times in his writings that he's getting the last elk. Well, luckily he didn't. And he went on to be one of the great figures in saving the bison and protecting wildlife in the American West. But there was this phase early in his life where there's a sort of, I don't know how to call it exactly, but an environmental recklessness about him. But what strikes me as so interesting is how he grew over time. And so later in his life, he forms the Boone and Crockett Club with George Bird Grinnell. They not only help to save the buffalo, but they do save Yellowstone National Park. Then he became the governor of New York, and he worked very hard on the Adirondacks. And then as president, you know his immense record. And his presidency ended by Roosevelt convening the first ever presidential governors conference in the White House, and the subject was conservation. Amazing, amazing achievement. But I go back to the question, why did he do it? Well, one answer is that when he was a child, he couldn't go to school because he was an invalid. So he was homeschooled, and he became very bookish. He read a book a day all of his life. And he read romance novels and dime novels about the American West, which were very mythological in their nature, including the works of a man named Mayne Reid, who wrote boys' fiction of the West. And Mayne Reid's books have titles like The White Scout and The Buffalo Hunter and Boys Against Indians in Arizona. And Roosevelt read these romance novels, and they filled him with a sense of the romance of the American West. That romance is at some odds with reality, but he was part of the same age as Owen Wister and Frederick Remington and Buffalo Bill Cody, all of whom were taking the raw materials of the American West and transforming them into a romance story that has been so powerful that it continues to be one of the most important American stories in the world today. If you go to Germany or France, they are more fascinated by the frontier than we are, and particularly by Native Americans. So part of this story is Roosevelt's reading as a boy, which sort of filled his mind with this imaginative universe of buffalo and cougars and cowboys and Indians and scouts. That's one element. A second element is that when he got here and got his buffalo, he got it down near Marmarth, North Dakota, he realized that if that was important to him, to kill the greatest of American quadrupeds, if that was some sort of a measure of his manhood, then what about his sons and his grandsons and their sons and grandsons? Would they be able to get their buffalo? And so he realized that in order to perpetuate that frontier experience, we had to preserve those species so that they would continue to exist in the industrial world. And so a kind of a light went on in his head out here, that the West is in danger of being transformed into an overly tame environment. That the West can only be preserved in its wildness if we protect the species that need habitat and set aside some places so that we don't overdevelop them. And here's where the national parks come in. As I said at the beginning, Roosevelt didn't invent the national park idea, but he, in a sense, gave us the philosophy that we now enjoy of the national parks. Because he believed that there was a danger. If you've ever been to Glacier National Park, how many of you have been to Glacier?
We
All right, so you know, comes later, James J. Hill, the man who created the Great Northern Railroad, was one of the people behind the creation of Glacier National Park because he intended it as a destination resort for his railroad. And the railroad goes right into Glacier National Park so that people could be dropped off right at the Grand Lodge there. And this is a European notion of nature, that you have wonderful resort lodges for the rich and the privileged, and they come in and they enjoy pleasures that common American people have no access to. It's sort of the Aspen, Colorado effect. If you've ever been to Aspen, if you come from my socioeconomic background, you feel a little like you shouldn't be there, that
Oh, exactly.
anytime they're going to move you out into Vail or some other place. Truly.
It's really bad. I
Roosevelt
agree.
regarded that as a scandal, the idea that we would allow the West to be locked up into pleasure resorts for the wealthiest and most privileged Americans. He said, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that there is a democracy of the national parks, that any American who has the will to do it will be able to go and will feel welcome and will not feel that there's some sort of class hierarchy being imposed upon him or her. And for Roosevelt, the experience in a national park was right here at this fire. His idea was you go out, whether you are one of the wealthiest people from New York or a rancher from Marmarth, North Dakota, or a railroad worker in Spokane, Washington. You go out and you get here and you squat around a fire and you eat bacon and beans and you drink camp coffee and you listen to the crackle of the fire and you tell ghost stories or stories of Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, and the stars come out, and as Huck Finn says, you ask whether they were always there or whether they was made. And then you listen to the sound of the first coyote of the night. You sleep on the ground. For Roosevelt, that's the national parks. So if you are here in your fifth wheel, you have betrayed Theodore Roosevelt. Because he doesn't want you getting out your moist towelettes and making some sort of filet mignon with a special raspberry reduction in your kitchen. He wants you to be squatting by the fire. And here's why. Roosevelt believed, this is another element in why he did what he did in the West. He believed that the experience that made America what it is was the frontier experience. He was a friend of Frederick Jackson Turner, who in 1893 published a famous essay called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. The idea of frontier, that there is a meeting ground of civilization and wilderness, that idea had lasted in American life from the time of Thomas Jefferson until 1890. And in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau retired the term frontier and said there isn't any anymore. There are a few pockets, but there really isn't a line on one side of which is civilization and on the other side of which is primordial land. They said that term no longer means anything. And when Roosevelt heard that, and when Frederick Jackson Turner heard that, they fell into kind of a fretful mood, because they both believed that that's what made America. People like Davy Crockett, George Rogers Clark, Daniel Boone, Lewis and Clark, people leaving civilization and going over the ridge and cutting down the trees to form farms and killing the varmints, admittedly displacing the Native Americans, and then slowly in that little wilderness clearing in Minnesota or that little wilderness clearing in Kentucky, you see a church, a school, a Masonic lodge, and slowly civilization then is regenerated again and again and again in the western frontier. There's some violence in it. There has to be a really strong character of the kind of people who can do that. And Roosevelt felt that that's what made America. That experience is different from England, it's different from France, it's different from Switzerland, it's even different from Canada. And that frontier experience, the Davy Crockett experience, is what made us the people that we are. And so his view was, now what? That the frontier is closed. What will happen to us now? Will we become effeminate? Will we become soft? Will we lose our national edge? Will we become over-civilized? And there are lots of studies about this interesting kind of debate that Roosevelt had with American civilization. But he didn't want to be one of those overly civilized people who go to clubs in New York wearing slippers. He wanted to be something more authentic. And so he came here in search of it, and he got it. He lived out here just when the little piece of this frontier was in its final heroic phase. And so he got that transfusion into his own character. He became the first cowboy president. He went to San Juan Hill because he had been a cowboy and a rancher out here. And so his national greatness was born here, and he rode this popularity for the rest of his life. We've gathered all the cartoons we can at the Theodore Roosevelt Center in Jenkinson. We've digitized them. They're magnificent. He was the most cartoon figure of his time. And he's almost invariably depicted in cowboy gear because of his experience here. But the question he had was, all right, I, Roosevelt, get that moment where I kill my buffalo and arrest my boat thief. What about everybody else? What happens to the over-civilized crowd of 2016? And his answer was, you come here, or you go to Arches, or you go to Glen Canyon, or you go to Big Bend, or you go to Mount Rainier, or you go to Great Smoky Mountains, and then you too strip some of the civilization away from yourself and get dirty for a few days and squat around a fire. And his view was, you'll be better human beings for it. So if any of you wants to sell your rig, see me afterwards. Do you understand what he's saying here? Is that this is an ennobling, quintessentially American experience, and we have to preserve it for people who live on the other side of the frontier era. And the national parks and the national forests and the national monuments will be that place where people can go refresh their spirit. And isn't that true? When I come out here, I actually have a calendar. I live in Bismarck, which is the state capital. The only capital named after a German dictator. I actually have a calendar in my house that I mark, and I can measure, I know this sounds a little too personal, I can measure my mental health according to the number of days per year I spend out here. When I come out here, I often come kicking and screaming because there's some horrible deadline, something that should have been done, and I come here and I think I can't afford the time, and I get out here and take a long hike, go sit in the Little Missouri River, listen to the sound of the coyotes, watch the stars, listen to the gurgling of the river when you camp nearby it, or listen to the sound in the cottonwood trees. There's nothing like a breeze in the cottonwoods. And after a few hours, certainly after a day or two, I feel human again. I feel returned to my body. I feel spiritually alive in a new way. My eyesight clears up a little. That's what he had in mind. I lived in England for 4 years when I was a young man, and I loved it. They have great newspapers and great universities, and there's so much about England that is marvelous, and some things I think are better than things we have in the United States. But the thing I missed most while I was there was here. I missed Wyoming, and I missed the Grand Canyon. It's really important that we understand the uniqueness of the American experience. You can't do this in England. You can't do this in Germany. There isn't a place where you can go and sit around the fire this way. We still have this enormous public domain in the American West, and thanks to people like Roosevelt, we have preserved it, or conserved it at least, and it's still available to us. And that, for me, has made all the difference in my life, and I know it's made all the difference in other people's lives who are here tonight. And we owe it to the national forests, but particularly to the national parks. And so Roosevelt's frontier theory led him here, and then led him to decide how he could perpetuate that experience in a time when we would be as urbanized and as materially comfortable as we now are. So just one more element of this. While Roosevelt was here, he saw two things. First of all, the magnificence of the American West. You know, he saw the Bighorn Mountains. He saw the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. He saw the Yellowstone Valley. He saw Devil's Tower. He saw the Black Hills. And he realized that there was an age before television, an age really before film. If you come from New York, you do not understand the West until you come to the West. And when you come to the West, oh my goodness. In 1903, as president, he went on a huge railroad journey around the American West. It took him to Yellowstone for 2 weeks, and he was in with John Muir in Yosemite, and he saw redwoods for the first time. But he also saw the Grand Canyon for the first time, and back then, we see the Grand Canyon in IMAX movies before we ever go there. But he saw it the way we don't get to. He saw it for the first time when he saw it on May 6th, 1903, and they were about to build some sort of an industrial installation there and a new hotel and so on, and without having a speechwriter of any sort, he spontaneously said this as he stood on the lip of the Grand Canyon. He said, "Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." Think of that. Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. Isn't that right? When I was up there today for the coin ceremony, I looked back at Painted Canyon. That's what I thought. Leave it as it is. Imagine if there were hotels there. Imagine if there were luxury ranch homes out there. Imagine if there were oil wells and storage tanks out there. We as a people chose to protect it from those things. We've chosen to protect certain small parcels of the American West against that kind of activity. That kind of activity is important, but it occurs on 85 or more % of the American landscape. But a few places we've decided are so beautiful or so fragile or so tightly wound up into the mythology of American life that we must protect them against any degradation. And the chief of those are wilderness areas, but the second tier is what we're celebrating tonight, the National Park System. Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. And then he went out to the redwoods on that same trip. And when he got to Santa Clara, they had put up plaques and signs on the trees, on the redwoods. Welcome, Teddy, and bully for you, and hello, Mr. President. And he threw a fit. I mean, he didn't very often throw fits. He was a pretty self-controlled man, but he actually threw a fit, and he said, "I'm not going to give my talk. I'm not going to give my talk as long as you're desecrating those trees." He said, "I'm going to take a little hike. When I come back, if those trees look a little better, I might give my talk." And so the poor local people had strained to prepare for him. They didn't know they were going to piss him off. And so he left on his little hike, and he came back, and they had taken all this stuff down, you know. And then he said this, he said, "You must understand that Europe has Notre Dame and St. Peter's and Salisbury and Cologne. These are our cathedrals. These are our cathedrals, and we must treat them with the same respect and even reverence that the Europeans show to their greatest structures." So think of that. Imagine William Howard Taft saying that. Even imagine Abraham Lincoln saying that. This is a unique human being. And while he was here for those 4 years, he saw some warning signs. He said, "You are overgrazing this land. There are too many cattle on it. You must have a grazing association so you can self-police the amount of cow-calf units. And he even said, if you overgraze it in this way, and you get a very dry summer and a very severe winter, you could have a perfect storm that could lead to a disaster, which is precisely what happened in the winter of 1886 and 87, when between 40 and 70% of the cattle of the Great Plains were killed by that horrific winter. When Roosevelt came here for the last time in 1918, he gave a talk in Beach, North Dakota, which is just up the road towards Montana. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, I loved here. I spent the 15 best years of my life here. He was always exaggerating. But he said, you are overgrazing this land. You are overtaxing this grass. And he was booed. Former President Roosevelt was booed in Beach for telling the truth about what happens when you don't conserve a resource as important as the grasses of the Badlands and the Little Missouri River Valley of western North Dakota. So in some sense, the ideas of conservation that came to characterize his presidency were born, or at least had their seed planted, during his experiences here. But still, for all of that, if I'm right about those things, the early romantic reading, the frontier thesis that he developed along with Frederick Jackson Turner, the magnificence of the West that just overawed him when he finally got to see it, his understanding of the fragility of the American West and the fact that we were, with runaway capitalism, we were stripping the trees, he called it stripping the land, skinning the land, he said once. And he called it game butchery when you kill buffalo for no reason, just to kill them. When he saw all of that out here, it created a growing understanding of how we must conserve resources in the West if we're going to continue to be a great nation in the 20th and later 21st century. So if all of that's true, if I'm in any way right about those elements, it still strikes me as utterly amazing that this one man who was president for 7 years and 171 days did all of that. If you try to think about the American West for 1 minute without Roosevelt in this equation, it's a completely different West. Last thing I'll say, and then maybe you have a question or two, is that Roosevelt wrote extensively about this experience. He wrote 3 books about his ranch life and his hunting life out here. And then later in 1914, he wrote his autobiography, 1913, and in it he has a chapter called In Cowboy Land. And I'll close tonight when we stop with just reciting one passage from that great book. But he wrote about this all of his life. He gets credit for the wildlife refuges. He gets credit for the national forests. He gets credit for the national monuments, and he deserves it. But remember, behind each of those moments, there was an army of people whose names you have never heard, who worked tirelessly year after year to call attention to what was being protected. In other words, there was no time when Roosevelt just looked at the map of America and said, I'll protect this and this and this and this and this and this. All these things percolated up over years and eventually got to his desk. And he was a great enough man and a leader of a man to say yes when that moment came. But those moments would not have come if it hadn't been for an army of nameless people who did the hard work against almost impossible odds and eventually brought enough attention to these endangered places to get presidential response. I think of people here like Jan Swenson of Bismarck, who worked tirelessly. You may never have heard her name if you're not from here, but worked tirelessly to try to protect western North Dakota in the face of this enormous industrialization we've been going through. It takes an army of such people to work all of their lives for low pay and almost no recognition for it finally to reach the desk of Barack Obama or Woodrow Wilson or FDR, or in this case, Theodore Roosevelt. And so, Emerson said that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. That's true in some ways of Roosevelt, but he was the first to admit that his achievement came on the backs of a lot of very, very, very interesting people whose memory and history is almost erased. All right, enough. Any questions or thoughts? I can't see EPA and the clean water bills and so on. Most people in the West thought that we had sort of achieved a steady state, a settlement, that this was the way the West was going to look forever. It's going to be largely empty of people. Such industrialization as already was there, but it was basically a giant part of the American continent that was essentially going to be left alone. There have been increasing pressures over the past years, and now with the miracle of fracturing and other forms of extraction of minerals, our technology is so breathtaking now that we're able to get at resources that couldn't even be contemplated in 1975. And you're going to see pressure on our water, pressure on our air, pressure on our public lands. The pressures are going to be almost unbearable in the next 50 or 60 years, and we're going to have to decide as a people, that's the burden of our democracy, how we want to respond to that. Do we want to respond by shrugging and saying, I guess that's how it is? Or do we want to have a robust dialogue about what we protect and under what circumstances? But we cannot, I guess the point I'm trying to make is we can't be complacent about the national parks anymore. We have been for a long time because they've served us so well. But they are under fire. They're underfunded. There's a lot of delayed maintenance. Very few of them cover their ecosystem. There are lots of perimeter issues of splendid luxury homes. And now there is the kind of extraction miracle, technological miracle that's taking place in the world and is coming right to the perimeter of our national parks. And so if we do nothing, I can promise you that the experience in the national parks will be compromised. If we do something, it's not clear what we can do, because we must respect private property rights. And Roosevelt was right that we want this country to be economically successful. At the same time, we want to preserve that which we can preserve. So the answer to your question is, I have no idea. Thank you very much.